Well, is there something in your life right now that you've been trying to fix for a long time? Not like weeks long time, but like years long time. A significant amount of time. Something that you've thrown everything but the kitchen sink at trying to get fixed. You've thrown time at it, you've thrown money at it, you've thrown all sorts of stuff, you've thrown your energy at it, and you've tried every strategy that you could think of. And that wall that you're trying to move, it's still there. It's still immovable. It's still unchanged. Maybe that wall for you is your marriage. You still love each other, sure. But over the years, things have changed, and you've gone through counseling, you've read all the books, you've prayed together, you've had the conversations, and for whatever reason, it just feels like more often than not, you're roommates and not partners. And somewhere you felt like that wall that you were fighting for, that marriage you were fighting for, you just started living around it. Maybe it was a kid. You poured your life into a son or a daughter. You coached every sport, showed up at every recital. You stayed up and had the conversations. You did all of the things. And then somewhere along the way in their 20s or 30s, they started to drift. And now there's a distance. You don't know how to close it. And you reach out trying to extend an olive branch, and they just keep pushing you further away. Maybe for you it's neither of those. Maybe it's something internal. Maybe it's a fear that you've got that keeps you up at 2 a.m. Maybe it's a habit that you've been struggling with, that you've been trying to manage in the dark for years. Maybe it's something that you've convinced yourself that, well, God is working for other people, that he just doesn't work in your specific situation, is what you've told yourself. You've told yourself that your wall is too old, your wall is too complicated, your wall is too far gone. And here's what many of us do when we hit a wall. We find a better strategy. We read a book, we get another opinion, we make a new plan. Because we've been told for our entire lives, we've been told in school, we've been told in the business world, we've heard every leadership talk that's been given, that the person with the best strategy is the person that wins. The person with the best plan is the one that wins. But what happens if the wall that you've been staring at isn't a strategy problem? What if it's a trust problem? What if it's a trust problem? See, there's this tension between what we can engineer and try and fix ourselves and what only God can do. And that tension is where we find the nation of Israel in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6 is a fascinating read. The people of Israel, they've been wandering the desert for the last 40 years. They finally get to this place called the Promised Land. And in those 40 years that they've been wandering the wilderness, a whole generation of Israelites has died. Their kids are now leading the charge. They cross the Jordan River. They cross on dry ground, which in and of itself is a miracle. They cross on dry ground, and the first thing they get to once they cross the Jordan River is the city of Jericho. Now, if you've been in church a long time, you know the city of Jericho. And you know the song that we sang in children's ministry, the walls of Jericho, right? But in that moment, the nation of Israel is staring at these gigantic walls. There's two walls surrounding the city of Jericho. It's about an 8-acre town. There's two walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. The inner wall and the outer wall, the inner wall is about 12 feet thick, 30 feet high. And so that the armies would sit on the top, and they would have this place where they could shoot down over the opposing people. So the nation of Israel, they see the miracle walking across the river on dry ground, and they get to Jericho and they see this fortified city. There's no way we're going to get through. No way we're going to break into this. And from the outside, they see this. They see the definition of what looks impossible. And that's when God shows up with his incredible battle plan. March around the city once a day in total silence for 6 days. And then on day 7, I want you to march around 6 times in silence, and then one more time. And on the 7th time, we're going to blow some ram's horns and we're going to shout, and the walls are going to come down. Now, that doesn't sound like a strategy to me, right? There's no assault weapons that they're coming in. There's no backup plan. They get to the wall of Jericho, and God says, I want you to walk around it. I want you just to march. And watch what I do. I want you to march and watch what I do. Put yourself in place for a moment. Just imagine you've spent 40 years wandering in the desert looking for this opportunity to get to the promised land. You finally get to the promised land, and there's a walled city. You can't get through. And the word that God gives you in order to make it through, to take the next step, is walk in circles. Like, that doesn't make sense. We don't comprehend it. It doesn't compute. But what God does at Jericho is going to say something directly to what you're staring at today. Because here's the thing about this whole story. Obedience starts with believing the victory is already decided. Obedience starts with believing that the victory is already decided. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 1, we read these words. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go out or in. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors. 2 verses. One verse has the problem. One verse sets the answer. And the contrast between verse 1 and verse 2 is incredible, right? Verse 1 says the gates were locked. They were in total shutdown. They weren't going in. If you actually look at the Hebrew text there, the word for shut is the word sagar, and they use that word twice, basically to help us understand the emphasis that the city of Jericho is completely and totally sealed in. There is no way for anybody to get in. That's verse 1. And then verse 2, God says, I have given you Jericho. Past tense. Not I will give you Jericho. God says, I have given you Jericho. They haven't taken a single step around the city. They haven't begun to march yet, but the battle is already over in God's mind. Commentators call this the prophetic perfect. The prophetic perfect, where God is speaking about events in the future as if they have already happened. Because from the vantage point that God is at, they have already happened. I want you to think about it with me like this. There's a fantastic thing that happens in our world called a solar, I gotta look it up, I can't see it, I can't even pronounce it. Analemma. I literally had to pronounce it out because it's a long word. A solar analemma. Analemma. A solar analemma. Basically, the gist of a solar analemma, it's a big word. It's a 50-cent word, by the way, for today. You can take that to all your friends and you can tell them you know what a solar analemma is, all right? You stand at the same spot, look at the sun, take a picture of the sun, same spot, same time of day, every single day for 365 days. What you're going to find is not a sun that traces across the arc, tracing a line in the sky. What actually happens is it produces a figure 8. From the ground, right, the sun, it looks like it's wandering all over the place. But from space, it looks like this perfect figure 8. This happens. There's this perfect pattern that's produced called a solar analemma. That's the prophetic perfect that Israel's dealing with. Because from where Israel stood at the ground level, looking up at these walls, there was no way in. The situation, it looked random, it looked impossible, it looked sealed. But from God's vantage point, where God was standing at, he could see the wall was already rubble. He already understood the outcome that was coming. Israel just hadn't caught up to what God was looking at. Because God doesn't always make sense to us. The prophet Isaiah reminds us of that in Isaiah 55. He says, my thoughts are not like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Church, can I tell you that the same God who spoke Jericho's defeat before the march began is the same God who's speaking over your situation right now. He's not pacing around heaven, wondering what he's going to do about the wall that you're facing. He already declared the outcome. You just haven't seen the wall fall down yet. Let me say it this way. You can't obey your way into a victory that God hasn't already prepared, but you can doubt your way out of one. You can doubt your way out of a victory. Israel could have done exactly what their parents did in Kadesh Barnea, where they saw this obstacle. They ran the math, did the calculations, and they decided that it wasn't going to work. And because they made that decision, they had to wander the desert for 40 years. That generation didn't get to enter the promised land. They let what they saw, what they could see, override what God had already said. Joshua 1:9 says, "This is my command, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." That's not just a great thing that we can plaster on our walls at home, we can put in a picture frame. That's a statement of theology in and of itself. That God is with us wherever we go. God doesn't send his people into situations that he hasn't already prepared them for. The courage is not that he's calling us to manufacture a confidence, right? It's confidence that comes from knowing the God who's already been in the situation, who's already faced the wall that we're coming up against. The victory has already been won. All Joshua had to do, all the people had to do was claim the promise and obey the Lord. They had to claim the promise and obey the Lord. Obedience isn't how you earn the victory. Obedience isn't how you earn the victory. Obedience is how you participate in the victory that God has already secured. See, most people, we don't believe that God is capable. We struggle to believe that God is able to do it for us in our situation. And what happens is we stare at the wall long enough, it stops being a problem that we're fighting, and it just starts to be a fact of life that we choose to manage. But Jericho says what looks completely sealed from your side is already open from his. The question isn't whether or not God can do it. The question is whether or not you're going to trust him enough to start marching. See, here's the thing about obedience. Obedience keeps moving when nothing is happening. Obedience keeps moving when nothing is happening. Hebrews chapter 11 says it was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith, the author says. By faith. By faith. It wasn't by strategy. It wasn't by tactics. It wasn't because of their superior strength. It was by faith. And the faith that the author of Hebrews is describing here is not a passive faith. It was 6 days of getting up every morning and marching around a wall that stood completely still. One revolution around the city a day. 20, 30 minutes, 40, depending on your walking pace, they would march and nothing happened. They go back to camp, they put their heads on their pillow, and they do the same thing the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and nothing changed. We were in our garden yesterday. I had finished, before we headed up here, I had to finish the drip irrigation so our garden could get water. And as I was sitting there finishing a couple things, Audrey comes out and she looks at me and she goes, "Look, my flowers are sprouting." I said, "Those are called weeds, babe." She's like, "No, I put seeds all over in that spot. They're flowers that are sprouting." What am I going to do? I'm going to keep watering it now, right? Because, okay, there's flowers, so we're going to keep putting the effort in. I can see the work that's happening. I can see that there's movement, there's stuff that's going. But did you know that there's a plant called a type of bamboo called Chinese maso or moso bamboo? Chinese moso bamboo, here's what's fascinating about it. You plant Chinese moso bamboo in the ground, you water it, you fertilize it for 4 years, and nothing happens. You plant it in the ground, you water it, fertilize it, nothing. Year 1. Year 2, water, fertilize, nothing. Year 3, water, fertilize, nothing. Year 4, water, fertilize, nothing. How many of you gave up after year 1 like me? Right? Like, I'm not seeing anything happening. It must be dead. 4 years, Chinese moso bamboo grows underground. Year 5, it sprouts 90 feet tall in 60 days. But that was year 5. 4 years watering, fertilizing, and you see nothing. But what was happening is underground, the root system was expanding. It was spreading hundreds of feet, building the infrastructure that would hold a 90 foot tall piece of bamboo. That wasn't breakthrough. That wasn't some random thing happening. It was the result of this invisible process going on that we couldn't see. 6 days of silence marching around Jericho looked exactly like the bamboo. They couldn't see anything. And Joshua's orders, no one talks. You just march. Walk around the city. They didn't have strategy sessions. They didn't call all the generals together and say, here's what we're going to do tomorrow. Let's gather all of our weapons, get your spears, get your ramming battalion things, and just walk. Put your sun hat on, put your sunscreen on, walk, and don't talk while you're at it. Think about what this looked like from the walls of Jericho. Like, think about what it looked like from the soldiers that were sitting on top of the walls of Jericho, looking down on the Israelites. They see these people walking around the city, not talking, day after day. They had to think they were crazy. Imagine if somebody walked outside your house and just walked around your house for a couple days, didn't say a word. They just took one stroll around your house, stopped, they came back the next day, stroll around your house, stopped, came back. Like, you might call the cops on day 5, right? Because, like, there's somebody weird that's walking around my house. They're not even talking to anybody. They're not on the phone. Their AirPods aren't in. Like, there's something weird about this. They don't even have a dog with them. It had to have looked crazy what they were doing. They weren't carrying any equipment with them. They just walked in silence. And that was the point. Because God consistently chooses methods to make sure that the credit doesn't go to the wrong person. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says, instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. When God designs a military battle plan that makes absolutely zero sense, what he does is he guarantees that when the walls fall, nobody in any direction needs to ask who did it, because they already know. God's methods are not random. They're intentional. They're designed to make his glory undeniable. But here's this part that I want to look at for a moment, because this is where obedience gets costly. See, most of us, we have no problem with obedience when it's producing something. We have no problem with obedience when we see progress, when we feel momentum, when we see things are going. We'll stay faithful all day long when we see stuff like that. The hard test isn't day 1. The hard test is day 4. It's day 5. The hard test is when you've been praying the same prayer for years and the wall is still standing. The hard test is when obedience costs you something and you got nothing to show for it, because that's where most people stop. Let me say something to you very directly this morning. Don't stop on 6. Don't stop on 6. Lamentations chapter 3 says, the faithful love of the Lord, it never
ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. Every morning Israel woke up, God's mercies were fresh. They were new. Every morning they had a fresh reason to get up, to march around. The wall hadn't moved, but guess what? Neither had God. God was still walking with them. And I don't know if you realize this or not, but God's track record was a little bit longer than the wall's track record. Don't stop on 6. Because the enemy, he doesn't need you to abandon your faith. He just needs you to stop one lap short. There's somebody here today that's about ready to stop. And I just want to tell you, don't stop on 6. The enemy wants you to give up because you haven't seen progress. You haven't seen anything happen. You've seen no momentum. Don't stop. Don't stop. See, we use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, 2 Corinthians says, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. The weapons that break your Jericho open aren't the weapons that the world uses. They're the ones that look foolish until the wall comes down. So that Israel gets to day 7. And we see that obedient trust produces the kind of victory that only God can take credit for. Obedient trust produces the kind of victory that only God can take credit for. Verse 20 of chapter 6, when the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, they shouted as loud as they could. And suddenly the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it. I got to tell you, I loved this passage as a children's pastor because you could see how loud you could get the kids to yell, and you could really teach them a lesson. Like, yell as loud as you can and knock the walls down. Obviously, I've never knocked walls down with getting the kids to yell in children's ministry, but it happened for the Israelites. They yelled. The walls came down. Joshua gives the word, the people shout, the walls come falling. And it wasn't like a section here and a crack over there. The entirety of the walls fall suddenly down. The text says the people charged straight in, meaning the walls fell completely flat. The wall that was standing in front of them now had become a ramp. Israel walked across the very thing that was standing between them and what God had promised. I got to tell you, that's not a strategy, that's called supernatural. And there's a difference between the two. 6 days, nothing visible. And then suddenly, completely, the wall becomes a ramp. That's how a lot of God's victories work. Invisible, visible, invisible, invisible. And then everything changes at once. People on the outside, they wonder where it came from. And the people who kept marching, they knew exactly. They knew exactly where it came from. In verse 27 of chapter 6, we see the Lord was with Joshua, and his reputation spread throughout the land. The text says that Joshua's reputation spread, but what commentaries and commentators make very clear is that, yes, Joshua's reputation, it spread, but his reputation was never separate from God's activity. The rumors were spreading throughout Canaan that, yes, Joshua was a great general, but the rumors were spreading that the Lord is with him. And what's going to happen is incredible. His fame, the fame that Joshua garnered because of this victory at Jericho, it became a visible sign of God's demonstrated power. One battle fought the way that God told them to fight, and it created a ripple effect everywhere. The victory at Jericho, it breaks the psychological grip that every other walled city in Canaan had. Because this one act of obedient trust, one moment where they chose to obey God, it produced a victory that multiplied beyond anything they could have calculated. Because when God wins your battle, the victory never stays just about you. When God wins your battle, it never just stays just about you. It shifts your family, the atmosphere there. It creates a testimony that outlives that moment. It becomes the thing that you tell your kids about, the wall that God brought down when you were faithful enough to keep marching. And right in the middle of this wall coming down, there was a scarlet cord that was hanging out of a window. A woman named Rahab, a Canaanite with a history that should have disqualified her. It was a woman that nobody would have expected. Her entire family was pulled out before the walls fell down. James chapter 2, it holds her as not a footnote, but it holds Rahab as a model of faith. It says in verse 25 of James 2 that she was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Understand, Rahab wasn't a religious person. She didn't grow up in faith. She didn't have a personal relationship with God. She didn't have a spiritual resume. She didn't have a track record. She had no theology degree. All she did is she had heard the stories about what God had done at the Red Sea. She heard the stories about what had happened at the Jordan River, and she made a simple decision. She said, I don't know this God personally, but I've heard enough about him to act. And so she tied a scarlet cord in the window and she waited. This woman, who was a prostitute, who everybody would have overlooked, became an example of faith. She heard enough about God to take one step. And that one step of obedience, that one step of faith that she took, God honored her so completely that Rahab ends up in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. This woman should have had no part in what was coming, but what got destroyed became part of how God was redeeming the world. This woman, everybody else overlooked. See, God, the victory that God wins isn't just a military victory. There's always redemption involved. When God's working victories on our behalf, there's always a Rahab in the story. See, in this story, Joshua is the military leader. Joshua's leading the nation of Israel through. In Hebrew, Joshua is the word Yehoshua, which means the Lord saves. The same name that Jesus has. Joshua, Jesus, the Lord saves. That's not a coincidence. The one who leads God's people across the Jordan River carries the same name as the one who leads people from death into eternal life. Jericho was the first enemy of Joshua's story, and death is the last enemy of God's story. And the method of victory is the same in both of these cases. It's not strategy, it's not strength. It is a divine act that makes absolutely zero sense by the world's standards. Because Jesus Christ didn't conquer with an army, he conquered with a cross. The nation of Israel, the Jewish people, they were waiting for a warrior king to come and save them from Roman rule. And instead, they got a savior who laid his life down in what would be the most decisive victory in the history of humanity. The walls came down, death lost, and the grave ultimately gave up. And if that's true, and I believe it with every fiber in my being, then the same God who said, I have given Jericho to you before the march ever began, is the same God that has spoken over whatever you're carrying today. And Romans tells us that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so maybe that's you today. Maybe you're watching today at a different time. Maybe you're not a religious person. You didn't grow up in faith, in church, but there's something that's telling you today that this might be real. The story doesn't make sense, but it might be real. Rahab's move was simple. She didn't have all the thought, all the theology. She just said, I'm betting on this God. And you can make that exact move today. You just need one act of trust, one step of faith. Let me give you a couple things to take into Tuesday, because it can be really easy to come on a Sunday and forget what we hear by Monday. First thing today, name your Jericho. Name your Jericho. Be specific about it. Don't walk out of here with some vague thought that God probably could help you with a couple of things. Be specific. Name it. Write it down. Name the wall. Name the marriage, the kid, the job, the habit, the thing that you've been white-knuckling for years on your own strength. Write it down. Because faith gets specific. Something changes when you stop. When you stop trying to engineer the outcomes, when you stop trying to manage the wall, something happens when you actually name the wall. And you say, this is that thing that's been staring at me. I'm done trying to knock it down on my own. God, this is yours. Name your Jericho. Number 2, keep marching. Keep marching. Don't stop on 6. Because you don't know what day 7 looks like. You don't know what day 7 looks like. You don't know the timeline. You don't know what God's working behind the scenes. But you know this, that God already declared the victory. Your job isn't to orchestrate the outcome of what you're looking for. Your job is to keep showing up. Your job is to keep marching, to keep taking one step in front of the other. Keep being obedient. Keep trusting until the walls fall down. The shout at Jericho, when they yelled, it wasn't, look what we've done. When they shouted, it was, look what you did. Look what you did, God. Stop trying to win this on your own strength. Hand it to God. He already declared victory over it. And keep marching, one day at a time. Because the God who brought Jericho to the ground is the same God who is fighting for you today. Don't stop on 6. God, we thank you for today. God, we thank you for this room. We thank you for your word. God, we thank you for showing up. God, we're not leaving here the same. God, whatever it is in our life, whatever wall we're facing, God, whatever thing is there that's standing between us and the life that you promised us, God, today we just simply say we're done managing it. We surrender to you, God. We give control to you, God. We name that thing. We're specific about it. And we hand it to you because you already see the victory. God, I pray you'd help us to trust. Help us to keep marching, even when it doesn't make sense. In Jesus' name, amen.